As Jeremy Clarkson has apologised for his column on Meghan Markle, is it right that he's now being labelled a sexist?
Well, that is a good question. A column by Jeremy Clarkson, as I'm sure many of you will remember, this was a couple of months ago, I think it came out, wasn't it, in which he said he was dreaming of the Duchess of Sussex being paraded naked in the street, and the press regulator has finally got round to ruling this as being sexist. He claims it was, in fact, a reference to the Game of Thrones, which he had failed to include that reference in the text, which would have situated it in a much more palatable context, obviously. But he got a record 25,000 people complaining to Ipso for that, which I suppose I don't know whether you get a cup or a trophy or something for that, but that's the Independent Press Standards Organisation. 25,000 independently outraged by that. The imagery was humiliating and degrading towards the Duchess. He has claimed that he's not a sexist. He is obviously quite happy with some of his more antediluvian views, but he regards himself as actually pretty clean on the sexism front. He would always be like stridently opposed to men being presumed to be better drivers and so on when he was presenting Top Gear. What do you feel that rings true?
I'm surprised. I'm not surprised that people don't like this, and you can indeed say there are humiliating parts of the column. Of course, the purpose of that imagery is to humiliate. But I don't necessarily see where the link is to the sexism, because last time I checked, I'm a man and all of those things, and if someone said they dream of me walking naked through the streets covered in excrement, I don't think I'd be like, well, it's all right, I'm a bloke. I'd say, I don't like it. It's wrong in either direction, so I don't necessarily see the sexism link. Like the racism link wasn't, the investigation didn't find any racism. I just don't see why there's sexism. There's definitely humiliation, but why is it specifically linked to her gender?
It does seem, doesn't it? There's a tendency to try and determine which dynamics are at play and unspoken.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would have thought that it was sexist because he'd only compared her to other women he hates. And I thought, well, you've brought that. That's your own projection. I mean, he's allowed to compare 3 women, isn't he? That's all right. Yeah, pretty shocking. I reread it this morning, and I'm of the opinion, generally, like, oh, come on, guys, relax. And I read it, and I did think, oh, yeah, it's... and he was sort of implying that he'd written it late at night, maybe he'd had half a bottle of red and a few scotches, but it had to go through the editorial process, didn't it? So somebody somewhere in an office went, yeah, that seems fine.
I always think that is the thing, isn't it? Where was the editor in all of this? But it is interesting how we hear these dog whistles all the time. I mean, the most famous example, of course, at the moment, in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, was the murder of George Floyd, found to be a murder. But the racism element obviously drove all of the protests against it, and yet that was completely unproven in court. There was no suggestion, in fact, wasn't even mentioned. But it's always the projection afterwards.